He's got a good reading voice. Maybe Lester, you begin.
Okay. Don't have as good a reading voice as Sharon and others, but I'll give it a go. Rupture, discontinuity, gap, break, abyss, disappearance, caesura, suspension, boundary, limit, accident, kairos, censorship, ecstasy.
So those are the words. Very different order of words, some of which work together, some are spatial, some are temporal, um, some are causal.
In Plato's book, The Republic, the figures of Adeimantus and Glaucon interrupt in the various exchanges, causing the dialogue to digress. The effect of this is to change the direction of the discourse, but in ways that are subtle and are thus relatively unattended in terms of later critique. Interruption was known as a rhetorical device in ancient Greek literature, but Plato also develops it into a key component of philosophical method, suggesting by implication the idea that philosophy interrupts us. Interruption can also be understood as a forerunner to exposing the device, making strange or the alienation effect within the 20th century art and literature.
So that's related. That's a reference mainly to Strosky and later on to Brecht. Strosky was a Russian formalist at the beginning of the 20th century, and Brecht was known for his epic theatre.
In his Notes on the Oedipus, Holderlin discusses the idea of a counter-rhythmic interruption, confronts the tendency of succession through the employment of pausing or caesura. In the case of the play Oedipus, or Oedipus, he attributes the manifestation of the caesura to the speeches of Tiresias, who is blind, but who sees everything, which contrasts with Oedipus who sees, but is blind to the truth. The caesura is the place where insight occurs, and therefore is not in direct speech or within representation. In the drama itself, when Oedipus sees the whole picture, he blinds himself, but this act is not seen by the spectators, but is instead indicated by a wailing sound because it is in excess of what can be witnessed.
Are there any comments upon that? And it's really interesting that Oedipus as an artifact has kind of solicited a lot of attention in the last 20, 30 years as almost a paradigmatic um, artifact of the period that we're in now. Yeah. Let me let Sharon in.
Holderlin interrupts, complicates, and even at times suspends articulated language. He discovers a speech that maintains silence. Alice Kuzniar. Poetry, in aspiring towards the condition of the pure word or caesura, and as such interrupts, forcing language to give way. In emptying or hollowing out language, a new reality is opened. After writing his first two critiques, Kant realized that there was a gap between nature or necessity and human freedom, so he wrote his third critique on the judgment of taste. This critique opened out the difference between cognitive reason and aesthetic judgment, and conceived beauty as an arrest of the faculty of understanding. Flowers, sorry,
Last one. Just read this one, then we'll switch.
okay. Flowers appear to signify their own attraction, and that attraction is organized through the manifest forms of beauty itself. We do not require concepts to understand this, and this being so is at the root of our pleasure within this encounter. Flowers almost appear, as if by design, to be a means of arresting vision. They might even make us feel that vision itself is a fragrance. They reproduce themselves through this power of attraction or solicitation. We might instinctively acknowledge that the flower, as a code of visual pleasure, is connected to the moment of arrest, and as such a vehicle that potentially takes us out of ourselves. Do we in this moment contemplate upon the fading and decay of the bloom, mortality, the end of history? In further contemplation, all these things are possible, but not within the immediate glance of the eye, because this glance is impelled by the desire of arrest.
Any comments?
I mean, this is a very Kantian notion of beauty residing within nature.
Yeah. I mean, it's written with Kant in mind. I mean, there are certainly other forms of being able to articulate beauty. I mean, it's contested a lot.
I mean, I think for me, one of the things, that's interesting about that passage is that beauty exists without concept, which then in Kant's mind, that beauty can be universal, understood by everybody without any kind of interface, which for me is an interesting way of looking at things.
Yeah, he said it pleases universally, but it doesn't imply that everyone finds something beautiful, just that they understand it could be understood as beautiful.
I think, didn't he say something that you had to have a certain, I forget how he phrased it, but a certain understanding or something? So it's basically saying, those people that had the understanding would find it beautiful, and those that didn't have the understanding.
It's an ethics. It's an ethical disposition towards the beautiful and the sublime that he's touching upon. So his whole interface between the idea of aesthetics and the idea of ethics is predicated upon that moral faculty. Sharon, you're the next.
She thought she was looking at some fragment of archaic ruins, but then realized that it was just the impact of wind upon rock. This switch in perception took place within the blink of an eye. Observe the light and consider its beauty. Blink your eye and look at it. That which you see was not there at first, and that which was there is there no more. Leonardo da Vinci. She said that living in the mountains had made her start thinking like mountains. Such a way of thinking was non-human or pre-human, but it introduced another dimension of time into her way of living. Vertical Red on Grey-White Boulder by Yan Wen Xiong. This boulder is located outside the Bapa village in Guangdong, Guazhou. Someone has to help me there.
Guazhou.
Guazhou. It has a long history.
Guizhou is Guizhou.
Guizhou, thank you.
黔东南贵州.
Thank you. It has a long history. According to legend, in the Ming Dynasty, Wu Wang, the king of the Dong, passed the place. He met a pregnant woman and asked, Can you see the cattle I am driving? The pregnant woman said inexplicably, I don't see any cattle. I saw a boulder moving. At this moment, the boulder stopped moving suddenly. Wu Mian whipped the boulder, which instantly turned into 3 sections, one of which flew to Xi'an, the second to Bapa, and the third one remained in Guangdong. The pregnant woman was so scared that her hair bun became crooked. So this is also the origin of the Dong women's buns, also always being crooked to one side. This boulder is now locally enshrined as a sacred mountain. Every new year, villagers pray under the mountain for good weather and good grain. The vertical red was on the mountain for 3 days. It accompanied these villagers day and night. At the 4th dawn, it disappeared, and now there is another bedside story about the red waterfall in the village.
The painting by the Chinese Ming artist Bada, who was people didn't know whether he was mad or whether he was feigning his madness. He had this way of painting fish as if they had human eyes.
The Chinese artist Bada Shanren, Ming Dynasty, disguised his identity and took up refuge in a Buddhist temple after the Manchu conquest of 1644. This gesture was termed Yimin, or leftover subjects of a fallen dynasty. When he painted fish, he introduced the look of human eyes, which animated the relationship between different living entities. The idea of an epistemological break or rupture was introduced by Gaston Bachelard in order to explain how obstacles within scientific understanding are overcome. This idea was developed in turn by Louis Althusser to explain the development in Marxist thinking in order to articulate the difference between 2 opposing approaches to the exposition of knowledge. I am a dreamer of words, of written words. I think I am reading. A word stops me. I leave the page. The syllables of the word begin to move around. Stressed accents begin to invert. The word abandons its meaning like an overload which is too heavy and prevents dreaming. Then words take on other meanings as if they had the right to be young, and the words wander away, looking in the nooks and crannies of vocabulary for new company, bad company. Gaston Bachelard, The Poetics of Reverie in 1960. The idea of a paradigm shift was introduced by Thomas Kuhn in order to explain deep structural change within beliefs about the way things are. Such changes might be sudden as opposed to slow incremental shifts. This implicates the notion that although the information might be the same, the way of interpreting it is subject to different perception of it. Skip James was a Delta blues singer who first recorded in 1931, but with little success. He drifted into obscurity and resurfaced in 1964 when he performed at the Newport Folk Festival. It had been presumed that he had already died. It is sometimes forgotten how Vermeer disappeared from historical visibility until he was recognized as a precursor to Impressionism in the second half of the 19th century. This illuminates how artists are not already formed within their working life, but how such formation can be the product of later shifts within historical events. So does that mean the world has to catch up with us, Jonathan?
I think it means something like that. That it means that the work of art has two different temporalities. One is in its present historical framework, and one is a future yet to come. You could say that the work of art is a secret of the present,
Mm.
the secret of the present which reveals the future.
Walter Benjamin was barely published within his lifetime, but from the period of the early 1970s, he became one of the most published and commented upon philosophers and writers of the 20th century. One of his central figures of thought was the dialectical image, which he in part defined as dialectics at a standstill, or as an interruption within the continuum.
So he's really influenced by Hölderlin and his idea of the Caesarea, or pure word, or the interruption. Caesarea is a term for a break in the musical melody or progression. It's an interruption. And he took this idea from Hölderlin on poetry into the idea of the dialectical image. So there's a direct relationship between almost there's a lineage between pre-Socratic philosophy in Greece, Romanticism, and post-Romanticism of figures like Benjamin.
The present is defined by Benjamin in the interwar years as the site of a tremendous shattering of tradition, a crisis in the communication of experience, in memory, and hence in the possibility of historical experience. Relations between generations are no longer the medium of historical continuity here, but crises, rupture, and misunderstanding. It is a world gone out of joint. Benjamin saw Kafka's work the impossibility of communicating the experience of modernity in the language of tradition. Once he was certain of eventual failure, everything worked out for him en route as in a dream. Kafka made a death mask for tradition. Brecht employment of interruption pervades his staging of the unfolding drama by utilizing freezing and framing devices or a change in direction. In this way, he cut the drama into pieces and thereby introduced the principle of montage, or the fragment. The fragment served to link the preoccupations of both Brecht and Benjamin in opposition to the totalizing aesthetic formulations of social realism. Discontinuous, incomplete, the fragment expands and contracts around itself, failing both to touch upon itself or to touch further still at the boundary or limit. Yet in this, it points towards that thing in which touching surfaces, and that thing is gesture residing in its ability to point towards that which cannot be completed in either task or communication. Gesture invariably accompanies interruption. I don't know if I'm unhappy because I'm not free, or if I'm not free because I'm unhappy.
It's still from a Godard film. Really Godard.
In Jean-Luc Godard's film Breathless, he introduced the idea of the jump cut and ways of talking both in character, but to the camera as well as if to draw attention to improvisation within the script. In this way, the film narrative was punctured on the level of its continuity as the audience were drawn into considering the devices of cinema. Godard developed such devices as characters addressing audiences directly, or text being introduced to break continuity. It was an adventure movie. Perrault Le Fou, 1965.
That's an early Godard film. This is from Weekend. Are you in a film or in reality? Mimo Rotella. The work is based on the principle of decollage, which employed the method of tearing away at existing street posters. Mimo Rotella, I do Visa, 1962. This is an image of Emmanuel Levinas, who was very close friends with Heidegger. He introduced Heidegger to the let me just let someone in. Introduced Heidegger to Blanchot. He was friends with Blanchot.
Levinas argues that ethics is the first philosophy, and at its center is the interruption between communication and ethics. In this, communication is troubled by having to face alterity, thus bringing the relation to the verge of new discursive possibilities. Interruption is therefore the beginning of a process of exposure.
Maurice Blanchot, one of the few photographs of him in old age.
Philosophy, which puts everything into question, is tripped up by poetry, which is the question which eludes it. Blanchot.
Image of Susan Sontag.
The function of writing is to explode one's subject, transform it into something else.
Kathy Acker, the writer.
Kathy Acker started to employ plagiarism in her writing as a device of employing multiple identities with her text. I came to plagiarism from exploring identity, and I wanted to see what pure plagiarism would look like. It was the simple fact of copying that fascinated me. I wasn't interested in the I of me, but in what the textural I looked like. So I took some biography and made it into an autobiography to see what would happen. I knew I wanted to plagiarize, but I didn't have a clear theoretical justification for what I was doing or why. So I just started finding these different texts and putting them together. Three white threads were dropped randomly and then fixed in position they fell. The employment of chance thus determined the final presentation of the work, which was described as stoppages. Duchamp thought that this work served as a gesture to liberate him from the past. Robert Morris Fox with the sound of its own making, 1961.
We discussed that last week.
What was so arresting about the Robert Morris presentation was its dislocation as to what its status was. Was it sculpture, conceptual art, or a conjunction of the process and presentation?
John Bassada, Dutch artist.
Jean Bassada created a whole number of events in which he staged falls. In this work, Fall 2, Amsterdam 1971, he falls into the canal. It's an act which suspends reason, gravity simply takes over. I do not make body sculptures, body art, or body works. When I fell off the roof of my house or into a canal, it was because gravity made itself master over me. Joseph Beuys, Capri Batterie, 85. When Joseph Beuys produced this multiple, he interrupted two different systems, one industrial and one natural, in order to suggest a unity of the two outside of their common identity.
Doris Salcedo.
The work of Doris Salcedo, Tabula Rasa 6, 2018 to 20, is composed out of a commonplace object of use that becomes transformed into a different form of object, namely an object for mourning the disappeared. In this way, it becomes a memory sculpture. The way that an artwork brings materials together is incredibly powerful. Sculpture is its materiality. I work with materials that are already charged with significance, with meaning they have required in the practice of everyday life. Then I work to a point where it becomes something else, where metamorphosis is reached. So sorry, is she a big influence for Mona Hatoum then?
Yeah. The other way round, perhaps.
Uh-huh. Georges Bataille described orgasm as the little death. As such, it is a sensation of discontinuity or jouissance. Roland Barthes related this to the experience of reading great literature. In the two photographs by Araki, one references the sexual climax explicitly, whereas the second image can stand as a release or a jouissance in the form of a splash of colour. In this, there is no measuring with time. A year doesn't matter, and 10 years are nothing. Being an artist means not numbering and counting, but ripening like a tree. Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. The Greek word kairos means right or the proper time for action. The release of the archer's arrow at the right moment or the delivery of a timely speech act within a play are examples. Kairos is understood more abstractly as the potential for overcoming dualism by weaving together such things as conflict and resolution. In this painting, Judith beheading Holofernes, Caravaggio presents the passage of the divine between life and death. The work captures the sense of a suspended interval in ways that anticipate the advent of cinema. In the so-called shower scene, Hitchcock evaded the rigid code of censorship through heightening of sound effects that created a psychological sensation of extreme terror. In turn, it became one of the most watched and studied fragments in the history of cinema. The films of Sergio Leone introduced a new way of depiction within the Western. The gunfights are extended in time by offering close-ups of faces in order to build the intensity of the various scenes. The effects is almost operatic, but this is undercut by a lack of continuous dialogues. Interruption and its attendant figures is a major aesthetic device for introduction of discontinuity into the fabric of the artwork, whether as a form of arrest, a staging of shock, or as an advent of a new configuration or direction. It introduces complexity into how the artwork is spaced and how it might discover a relation.
These are various books.
Sorry, Jonathan, who wrote The Accident of Art? Which one was that?
Oh, this is right.
Sorry, just back.
An interview with Paul Virilio, Silva Lotchinger.
Thank you.
Thanks for Lester and Sharon for the reading. So interruption.
So how would you apply interruption? Oops. How would you apply interruption, Jonathan, do you think, as an artistic device?
I think it's always in some way present, one way or another, either formally or deep within the aesthetic. Or
So would interruption be along the lines of intensities or difference?
I think they're implied within. Intensity implies a state of change in the temperature, for instance. So it's not just a transition, it's an eruption. So anything which is an eruption or a rupture or an ecstasy indicates a different space in a different temporality. It could be an excitement, it could be a fall, it could be a dispersal. And it could be that art interrupts life. I mean, it's the other side of materiality, isn't it? So you have mediums which often indicate materiality, but you don't have necessarily figures like interruption as part of the process of making the work.
So, interruption, can I consider as like a third space of something like in betweenness?
I mean, it often takes place in between interruption. I mean, as in between.
So it's part of it.
It's part of it. It's also a transition. So it could be
Provisionality.
a sort of change in visual intensity or a change in pace or a change in relationships.
Could we
Brett.
say
Brett, for instance, would often get his actors to turn to the audience and say, well, what do you lot think? In the middle of a narrative, they break the narrative to ask what the thought processes are. Shosky would remind the reader that he or she is reading a text, and the feeling of the the writing, the actual physical act of writing, is indicated to switch attention from the illusion of an image to the actual production of an image. So it emphasizes the productivity of the action which is going to make the work of art. Sorry, I interrupt rudely.
But it isn't that the point of tonight's session?
Yes, but not to do it rudely.
I was going to ask, because a few weeks ago we talked about the ideas or the concept of drawing, and could drawing be considered a form of interruption?
Yeah, I think drawing is interruption between there not being anything and there being something. It interrupts, it makes a passage, but it is also an interruption of the two. So it can look back into a state of there being nothing and look forward to being something. So drawing is a coming into presence, which indicates a rupture to begin with, or a gap to begin with. I mean, the work of art also takes hold of something, takes hold of an audience, or takes hold of the maker in different ways. It's often untimely, so that idea of the untimely plays a significant role. The idea of kairos, time's arrow, rupture of time. So these exotic terms like kairos and Caesarea, culled from the ancient world, are all present within the contemporary context. I watched a very bad, I won't even quote the film, but I watched a very bad film about a diplomat, not a diplomat, a politician. And he would talk to the camera. He would, when there's a scene unwrapped, he'd turn to the camera and talk as if no one was hearing. And he would say, watch this person fall apart as I apply the pressure. Or, I mean, it's sort of interior monologue. That's typically Brechtian, but in a sort of much more popular framework. It's also often an outcome of an indecision or ambiguity. So a box with a sound of its own making, is it a temporal object, or is it an object in space? Is it a sound piece, or is it a assemblage?
Why does there need to be a distinction between the two?
Because it arises out of habit. It maybe solve the problem of the relationship between the two. I mean, maybe the point of it is it overcomes the difference, makes us able to think of things together. So a sculpture can be performative, it can be reiterative, But up until the time when he made that, it was what was particularly aligned with the spatial.
It gives one more dimension to the sculpture itself. It used to be just like three-dimensional, objective.
This idea of epistemological break in Bachelard it was applied by Althusser to the study of Marx, and he divided early Marx, the Marx of Hegelian lineage, with the Marx of Spinoza, a mature period. So he said that the two periods are contradictory, and therefore it constitutes a break. There's a rupture in Marx between early and late Marx, between the idealist Marx and the materialist Marx. So often when we get stylistically a transition between, let's say, the Mannerist period and the Baroque period, there's all sorts of breaks occur. You see that in Caravaggio. Caravaggio is a transition from Mannerism into Baroque, and his subject matter is particularly violent very often, if not violent, incredibly intense. And he introduces a new visuality into the aesthetic, one which can be said to almost introduce the cinematic code.
But thinking about this idea of temporality, it might just come ahead of its time. So it sits outside. It's not necessarily a rupture through the middle of what we know as a continuum now, looking backwards. It sort of sits forward, doesn't it, of what's been. And then in a way the world kind of catches up. So it's a shock at the time, but it maybe sometimes it's also not, it's definitely not understood as it's sort of so far ahead of itself.
Yeah, it's not seen. Seen. So you get all these narratives about artists who disappear, discovered late. I mean, famously, the story of abstraction is completely rewritten by forgotten figures. The earliest abstraction was meant to be Kandinsky, 1910, but Alma Alf Klint was doing abstract paintings in 4 or 5 years earlier. But there was no visible record of that, no art historical framing of it. So if we revisit in 30 years' time the period which we were living in, we'd be surprised at the new alignments and new privileges and
because something that we can't see now, we're blind to, is already taken, is already happening or happened.
yeah.
We'll only be able to see it historically looking back.
I mean, it's like the way of saying the artwork often interrupts history. History is as telos, as continuous as succession of time. That's why you get so much references to against the grain or the idea of rupture or discontinuity. Any last points? We'll move to Alex, if that's all right. I think some of the preoccupations of that PowerPoint are Alex's preoccupations.